Billionaire refuses to speak with the judge, but he never expected this from her. The billionaire refuses to speak to the judge, but she has a surprising response. In the courtroom, she offers him a chance he never expected. A transformation unfolds that changes everything. The cold air inside the courtroom seemed to freeze every word spoken, as the tension in the room thickened like a dense fog. The smell of polished wood from the old oak benches mixed with the sharp scent of freshly printed papers and anxiety. The hum of distant whispers echoed. The metallic clink of the door swinging shut reverberated in the silence. Judge Evelyn Hawthorne stood at the bench, her gaze unflinching as she observed the man before her. The billionaire, whose life of luxury had suddenly turned into a spiraling nightmare. Harrison Blackwood, tall, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that seemed to scream power, refused to make eye contact with the woman seated on the other side of the courtroom. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles white from gripping the edge of the table, and his broad shoulders were tense with a mixture of anger and humiliation. He stared straight ahead, ignoring the woman who was supposed to preside over his fate. There was a look of disdain in his eyes, a look that said, "I am above this. I am above her." Yet, it was in this moment of silent defiance that Evelyn's heart hardened with resolve. She had seen it all before, the arrogance of the powerful who thought they could bend the world to their will. But today, Harrison Blackwood would learn that not everyone could be bought. Not everyone could be controlled. Harrison's thoughts were clouded with fury. His mind raced back to the moment everything had started to fall apart. The betrayal of his closest confidant, the woman who had been everything to him. The sharp sting of that betrayal still haunted him. How could she, of all people, do this to him? He had given her everything, his trust, his heart, his empire. And she had shattered it all, as easily as breaking a fragile vase. He could still feel the bitter taste of whiskey on his tongue, the bitter laughter of his so-called friend echoing in his mind. And there she was, the one person who could end it all, who could tear apart everything he had built. She had brought him to this moment, forcing him to stand before the one woman who was going to pass judgment on his actions. But Harrison was not afraid. Not of her. Not of anyone. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence as the judge stood. Her dark eyes met his for the first time, a steady calm behind them. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice as sharp and cold as steel, "you may have all the money in the world, but you cannot buy justice. You cannot buy forgiveness." Harrison sneered, his lips curling into a smug, almost dangerous smile. "I don't need your forgiveness. I don't need anyone's." Evelyn stood tall, unwavering, as she walked down from the bench. Every step echoed in the cold, sterile room, but it was her presence, not her stride, that commanded attention. She stopped directly in front of him, looking him in the eyes, the only barrier between them being the courtroom table. Her voice cut through the silence, once more, low and deliberate. "You're wrong, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her words hanging heavily in the air. "You will need someone, and when you least expect it, the truth will find its way to you." The tension between them crackled like electricity, and Harrison could feel it in his bones, a coldness settling deep in his chest. His pride surged again, and he leaned back in his chair, trying to regain control over his emotions. His life was a fortress of wealth and influence, and yet here he was, defenseless in the face of a woman who didn't even seem to care for his money or status. She hadn't even flinched at his dismissive attitude, not like the others. The others had been swayed by his charm or intimidated by his wealth, but not Evelyn. She saw him for what he truly was, broken and vulnerable, no different than anyone else who walked through these doors. His pulse quickened as he remembered the darkest moment of his life. It had all unraveled so swiftly. His wife, whom he had trusted above all else, had betrayed him. The affair was just the beginning, but it had been the final straw. The sting of her treachery cut deeper than any financial loss he could ever face. How could she throw it all away? How could she make him feel this small, after everything he had done for her? The echoes of his humiliation still rang loud in his ears. Is this how it ends? He thought bitterly. A woman, of all people, will be the one to end me? His mind raced, reeling with anger, frustration, and a sense of helplessness he had never known. For all his wealth, for all his power, none of it mattered now. The woman he had trusted had betrayed him, his empire was crumbling, and now here he was, alone in a courtroom, looking at the one person who held his fate in her hands. But there was something about Evelyn's calm demeanor that made him feel even more enraged. There she stood, unyielding, as if immune to the storm that raged inside him. Her presence was like an immovable rock in a turbulent sea. "You think you have it all, don't you, Blackwood?" she said, breaking his thoughts. "But I'm here to tell you that what you have is nothing but a mask. Beneath it all, you're just as human as the rest of us." Her words, though quiet, cut through him with surgical precision. The weight of them seemed to settle on his chest, suffocating him. He could feel the walls closing in, the reality of his situation crashing down on him. His fortune, his reputation, all of it felt so empty now. Harrison shook his head, trying to banish the doubts that crept into his mind. "This is just another game," he thought. "Another test. I'll win like I always do. I'll find a way out." But deep down, something had shifted. He had been so sure of his invincibility before, but now, for the first time, he was uncertain. This wasn't just a courtroom battle, it was a fight for something far more important: his humanity. As the silence stretched, Evelyn's voice cut through it once more, her tone even and steady. "You've lived your life hiding behind money, hiding behind your empire. But no amount of money can save you now, Mr. Blackwood. The only thing that can save you is facing the truth. And it starts with you." Harrison's pulse raced, his heart hammering against his ribcage. The truth. What truth? Would facing it really change anything? Could he really be redeemed? Evelyn's words echoed in his mind as the room seemed to close in around him. He wasn't sure if he could bear it, but he knew one thing for certain. The game he had played for so long was over. And whether he liked it or not, the woman standing before him might be the only one who could show him the way out. Evelyn Hawthorne had always been more than just a judge. She was a force to be reckoned with. Her rise to the judiciary had not been easy. She had fought tooth and nail to get to where she was. Born into poverty, she had witnessed the harsh realities of life that most people in positions of power would never understand. Her mother had been a lawyer, her father a blue-collar worker, and Evelyn had seen firsthand how the system favored the wealthy while leaving the rest to fend for themselves. Her decision to become a judge was not born out of ambition, but out of a deep-rooted sense of justice. She had witnessed her mother's struggles, her father's silent sacrifice, and it had shaped her understanding of right and wrong. But this case was personal. Years ago, Evelyn had crossed paths with Harrison Blackwood at a charity event. He had been charming, confident, and full of himself, qualities that made him nearly impossible to resist for someone like her. But beneath that perfect exterior, Evelyn had sensed something darker, a coldness in his eyes, a sense of entitlement that never truly sat well with her. And then came the day she discovered the truth. Harrison had been involved in a scandal, one that had rocked the city to its core. A betrayal of his own company. A breach of trust so severe that it could have shattered everything he had built. He had manipulated the market, used insider information, and ruthlessly crushed anyone who stood in his way. His empire wasn't built on hard work. It was built on lies and the ruin of others. That's when she realized Harrison Blackwood was not just a man of wealth and power. He was a man who had crushed everyone around him to get ahead, leaving destruction in his wake. And as much as she hated to admit it, she was now the one who had to deliver the final blow. The system that had once allowed him to thrive was now turned against him, and Evelyn was the one standing between him and the consequences of his actions. As Evelyn watched him sitting before her, refusing to acknowledge her, the weight of the situation hit her. She was his judge, but she was also his reckoning. She knew she had to stand firm, despite the history between them, despite the feelings she had once harbored for him. Her mind flashed back to that night at the charity event, the allure of his presence, the magnetic pull that had made her want to believe in him, to hope that he wasn't as cold as he seemed. But she had learned the hard way that sometimes the most charming people were the ones capable of the greatest betrayal. She had allowed herself to be fooled once. Now, she would not let his charm or arrogance sway her. Evelyn could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her. They were waiting for her to break, to show weakness. But she would not. She stood there, steady as ever, watching Harrison's silent defiance. He wasn't just refusing to look at her. He was refusing to acknowledge the very system that had made him fall from grace. He thought he could control the narrative, that his wealth and power could shield him from accountability. But she wasn't about to let that happen. The room was thick with tension, the silence unbearable. But then, something unexpected happened. Harrison stood up abruptly, his movement sharp, as if the room itself had become too suffocating for him. His gaze was fixed on the door, but his voice, when it came, was low, almost defeated. "I don't need to say anything to you," he muttered, his words directed at the air between them. "I don't need to explain myself." Evelyn didn't flinch. She had expected this. But what she hadn't expected was the weight of his words, the quiet admission hidden within his refusal to speak. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't defiance. It was resignation. In that moment, Evelyn realized that Harrison Blackwood, for all his wealth and power, was just as trapped as anyone else. He had built an empire on lies, but now he was ensnared by them. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice unwavering, "you don't have to explain yourself. The truth is already here. And it's not going anywhere." He looked at her then, his eyes no longer the cold, calculating gaze of a man who thought he could escape the consequences. They were weary eyes, burdened by the weight of everything he had done. For the first time, Harrison Blackwood seemed small, vulnerable, just a man, and not the titan he had once thought himself to be. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've done things that can't be undone." Evelyn's eyes softened for a brief moment. She had spent so many years fighting for justice, never allowing herself to feel sympathy for anyone, not even those who deserved it. But here was Harrison Blackwood, a man who had everything, yet now faced the ultimate consequence of his actions. The system had finally caught up with him, and in that moment, he was no different than any other defendant who had entered her courtroom. But then, just as quickly as it had softened, her resolve returned. She could not afford to show him mercy, not for the sake of justice, and certainly not for the sake of her own integrity. "The truth doesn't care about your regret, Mr. Blackwood," she said firmly. "It's here to stay. And so are the consequences." Harrison looked away, unable to meet her gaze any longer. He had been a master of control, but now he was the one who was controlled. And Evelyn would not allow him to escape the reckoning he had brought upon himself. The plot twist, however, was yet to come. Just as Evelyn was about to speak again, the door to the courtroom suddenly swung open. The murmur of surprise spread like wildfire through the room as a figure stepped inside, a woman. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. It was the one person she least expected to see, the woman who had once been Harrison's right hand, and the one person who knew more than anyone about his darkest secrets. She had come to testify, and her testimony would shatter everything Harrison had fought to protect. For Harrison, the pain was suffocating. His life had been a carefully curated illusion of success, of power, of control. He had built it from the ground up, step by step. But the moment he trusted someone else, someone he thought would never betray him, that illusion had crumbled. Catherine, the woman who had been his partner, both in business and in life. The woman who had claimed to love him, but had instead been plotting behind his back. It had been a slow burn, the realization that something wasn't right. First, it was the whispered conversations when she thought he wasn't listening. Then it was the late nights in the office, the cryptic texts, and finally, the discovery of the truth. She had been seeing someone else, a man who had worked for him, a man who had been his confidant. And together, they had stolen everything, his company, his trust, his dignity. Harrison had never felt so small, so utterly destroyed. The very foundation of his life had been ripped apart in an instant. He had trusted her with everything, and she had thrown it all away for power, for greed. The betrayal cut deeper than any wound he had ever felt. It wasn't just the loss of his company or his wealth. It was the loss of someone who had promised to stand by his side, who had promised to never leave him. The person he thought would be his greatest ally had become his greatest enemy. As the courtroom continued to buzz with anticipation, Harrison sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the floor. He could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on him, but he refused to look up. It was as though if he didn't acknowledge anyone, if he didn't speak to the judge, the jury, or even his own lawyers, he could remain suspended in his own version of reality. His world was falling apart, and yet, all he could do was refuse to play along. But what Harrison didn't expect was the way Evelyn would handle his silence. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze in the tension of his defiance. The judge, his judge, stood tall at the bench, her eyes narrowed. But there was something else in them, something he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the cold judgment he expected. It was something much sharper, a quiet, simmering determination. "You think silence will save you, Mr. Blackwood?" Evelyn's voice cut through the room with precision, yet there was a calmness to it that made everyone hold their breath. Harrison didn't look up. He didn't move. He didn't care. But then, something surprising happened. Evelyn stepped down from the bench, her heels clicking against the floor with each deliberate stride. She moved toward him, her gaze unwavering. The room fell completely still. "I've seen men like you before," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Men who think they can hide behind their wealth, their arrogance, their silence." Harrison's heart began to race. This wasn't the judge he expected. He had anticipated her to be an obstacle, a force of the system to be maneuvered around. He had underestimated her. She stopped in front of him, standing close enough that he could feel the weight of her presence. For the first time in his life, he was made to feel small, not by the accusations, not by the scandal, but by this woman, standing before him. Evelyn didn't need to raise her voice. "You don't get to control the narrative anymore, Harrison. You don't get to ignore the consequences of your actions." Her words were slow, deliberate. He looked up then, his eyes meeting hers. For the first time in a long time, he felt an uncomfortable pang of vulnerability. He had built his empire on manipulating people, on controlling the story. But this woman, this judge, was rewriting the rules. Harrison opened his mouth to speak, to defend himself, to say anything, but Evelyn raised her hand, silencing him. "You don't get to speak yet," she said firmly. "Not until you hear the truth, the full extent of what you've done." Harrison's body tensed. His throat tightened. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was a reckoning. And as Evelyn's voice echoed through the courtroom, the truth of his betrayal began to take shape. "I don't care about your wealth, your status, or your charming exterior," she continued, her words laced with authority. "What you've done to the people who trusted you, those who believed in you, can't be undone. And for that, you will pay." But then, just as Evelyn was about to continue, the courtroom doors slammed open once more. Everyone turned in shock. Standing in the doorway, bathed in the light from the hall, was Catherine, the woman who had once been Harrison's greatest ally, his closest confidant. Evelyn's gaze shifted toward Catherine. There was no surprise in her eyes. She had known this moment was coming. Catherine walked into the room slowly, her face a mix of determination and remorse. And in her hands, she held the final piece of the puzzle, a file that would expose everything Harrison had tried to bury. The plot twist was just beginning. The courtroom had never felt more suffocating. As the days passed, Harrison's situation grew more dire. His empire was crumbling, and with each passing moment, the humiliation piled on. His name, once synonymous with success and luxury, was now the subject of public mockery. His every move was scrutinized, and the media relentlessly tore him apart. He had always been the one in control, the one who called the shots. But now he was at the mercy of the law. And worse, he was at the mercy of a woman who had no sympathy for him. Evelyn, on the other hand, had never felt more sure of her actions. She had heard the whispers of Harrison's arrogance, his cruel disregard for those beneath him. But now, She was the one who had the power to make things right. She had seen the consequences of his greed, of his cruelty, and she was determined to bring him to justice. The days dragged on in the courtroom. Harrison had long since stopped trying to defend himself, his silence, now a defiant refusal to engage. It was as though he was hoping that if he didn't speak, if he didn't acknowledge his role in the destruction of everything he had built, the weight of his actions might somehow disappear. But Evelyn wasn't the type to let anyone hide behind silence. She had dealt with powerful men who thought they could escape accountability, and she had learned long ago that the law had a way of catching up with them, no matter how far they ran. One afternoon, after another round of testimonies, Harrison once again refused to meet her gaze. Evelyn stood from her seat, her heels clicking sharply as she approached him. The room fell into an almost eerie silence, all eyes on her as she closed the distance between them. "I see you're still unwilling to speak, Mr. Blackwood," she said coolly, her voice cutting through the tension. "But I don't need your words to know exactly who you are. You've made that clear." Harrison didn't look up, his jaw clenched, his expression unreadable. "I want you to listen closely," Evelyn continued, her voice steady but firm. "You think you can remain silent and untouched, that by refusing to engage, you can avoid the consequences of your actions. But let me remind you, Harrison, the truth is already out there. Your silence only speaks louder than any words could." The room was silent except for the sound of Evelyn's voice. Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. Evelyn paused, her gaze unwavering. She was getting to him. She knew it. "Your wealth, your power, they can't save you from this. Not anymore. The damage you've done, the lives you've ruined, it's too great to overlook. But you have one chance to make it right." Harrison's eyes flicked up toward her then, the briefest moment of defiance flashing in his gaze. "Make it right," he muttered under his breath, his voice almost inaudible. "Yes," Evelyn said, her voice hardening. "But it's not just about you anymore, Mr. Blackwood. It's about the people you've crushed beneath your heel. And it's about accountability." Harrison felt the weight of her words, and for the first time since this trial began, he couldn't push them away. Evelyn wasn't just a judge. She wasn't just delivering justice. She was holding a mirror up to him, showing him the man he had become. But before he could respond, the door to the courtroom opened with a loud bang. Catherine stepped inside, her expression tight. She held a thick folder in her hand, the weight of it clearly evident. Evelyn turned to face her, her brows furrowing. The unexpected appearance of Catherine, the woman who had once been so entwined with Harrison's life, sent a ripple of shock through the room. "Catherine?" Harrison's voice was barely a whisper. She ignored him, walking toward the judge's bench and placing the folder on it with a deliberate thud. "I think this belongs to you," she said, her tone icy. Evelyn glanced at the folder, her gaze flickering with recognition. She knew exactly what it contained: documents, emails, evidence that would further seal Harrison's fate. The weight of it hung in the air. Harrison's heart sank as he looked from Catherine to Evelyn, realizing the trap had been set. Catherine had always been his accomplice, his partner in crime. But now, it seemed she had decided to cut her losses and expose him for everything he truly was. "I'm done," Catherine said coldly, her eyes never leaving Harrison. "You thought I was with you, but I was never on your side. You were too blinded by your arrogance to see it." The courtroom gasped as the truth of her betrayal hung heavy in the air. Harrison was stunned, unable to find the words to defend himself. The weight of his betrayal, of Catherine's betrayal, bore down on him like a crushing wave. But Evelyn wasn't finished. She turned back to Harrison, her expression softening only slightly. "This is it, Mr. Blackwood. This is where the lies end. The truth will set the course now." As Catherine stood by, Harrison realized the game was over. His silence, once a defense, now felt like the final confession. The plot twist had come, just not in the way he had ever imagined. Days turned into weeks, and Harrison's world continued to unravel. He found himself in the same courtroom day after day, facing Evelyn with increasing bitterness and resentment. But despite his anger, something began to change in him. Something that made him realize just how far he had fallen. He had spent his life building an empire, amassing wealth and power, thinking that he could bend the world to his will. But now, as he sat in this courtroom, stripped of his former glory, he understood the emptiness of it all. The silence he had once used as a shield now felt like a weight, suffocating him, reminding him of all he had lost. He could no longer ignore the reality that the empire he had worked so hard to build had come crashing down, and with it, his identity. And then it happened. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal session, Harrison walked into the courtroom, expecting the usual cold reception. But when he looked up, he saw something he had not anticipated, a faint glimmer of sympathy in Evelyn's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him pause. For the first time, he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was someone in this world who understood what it was like to lose everything. Someone who, despite the pain, was still willing to show mercy. Evelyn, the woman who had once seemed like an unyielding force of justice, now seemed less like an adversary and more like a reflection of his own turmoil. Her eyes weren't just cold and accusatory. They were filled with something that Harrison had never expected from her: compassion. It was a fleeting moment, but it hit him harder than anything else had. Could it be that she saw something in him, something beyond the man who had destroyed so many lives? He stood there for a long moment, grappling with the realization. He had expected Evelyn to be his ultimate judge, to be the final reminder of everything he had done wrong. But now, she seemed to be more than that. Could it be that, deep down, she understood the pain of losing everything? Could she, of all people, offer him something he never thought he would get: mercy? Harrison opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The silence between them felt heavier than ever. Evelyn remained calm, her gaze unwavering. She had always been one to keep her emotions in check, but today, there was something different in her expression. She knew that the road to redemption for Harrison wouldn't be easy. And yet, for a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to consider what it would be like if he could change, if he could truly face the consequences of his actions and take responsibility for the lives he had destroyed. The courtroom grew tense, with the unspoken tension between them. Harrison was no longer just the powerful billionaire. He was a man broken, stripped of his illusions, standing before a woman who had the power to shape his fate. For a long moment, Evelyn said nothing. She didn't need to. Harrison could feel the weight of her silent judgment, and it was enough to make him question everything he thought he knew about power and redemption. "I think it's time for you to speak, Mr. Blackwood," Evelyn said softly, her voice a little gentler than before. The words were simple, but they carried a weight Harrison had never anticipated. He had spent so much time trying to avoid speaking, trying to protect his fragile ego. But now, as he stood before her, he knew that silence would no longer serve him. If he wanted any chance at redemption, he had to face the truth, no matter how painful. Harrison swallowed hard, his throat tight. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes betraying a vulnerability that he had never allowed anyone to see before. I don't know where to begin," he whispered, his voice raw. Evelyn's gaze softened slightly, but she said nothing. She simply waited. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For the first time in weeks, Harrison felt like he was on the verge of something that could change everything. But as he looked at Evelyn, he couldn't help but wonder what it would cost him to finally make things right. Would the mercy she had shown him be enough to guide him toward redemption? Or would he fall back into the same trap that had caused his downfall in the first place? The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Harrison Blackwood was no longer the man who had walked into that courtroom all those weeks ago. Something had shifted, and now, for the first time, he was willing to face the consequences of his actions. The only question now was whether Evelyn would allow him the chance to make amends, or whether her final judgment would be as unforgiving as he had feared. In the weeks that followed, Harrison found himself lost in a whirlwind of emotions. He had never imagined that a courtroom, a place that had once felt like his domain, could leave him so shaken. The words Evelyn had spoken continued to echo in his mind, and the more he thought about them, the more they unraveled everything he had ever believed about himself. He had spent his entire life building an empire, surrounded by wealth, power, and control. To him, these were the things that defined a man, things that kept him at the top, above everyone else. But in that moment in the courtroom, all of that had been stripped away. For the first time, Harrison felt vulnerable, exposed. The days after the trial were the hardest. He couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that Evelyn's words had planted deep inside him. It was as if they had triggered something he had long buried, something he had refused to acknowledge. Harrison had been too busy climbing the ladder of success to see the damage he had caused along the way. But despite the turmoil in his mind, he did his best to keep up appearances. He returned to his office, attended meetings, and managed his company with the same ruthless efficiency he had always done. Yet something was different. His mind wasn't fully there. His thoughts kept drifting back to the courtroom, to Evelyn, and to the words she had spoken that day. He couldn't bring himself to speak to her. The very idea of facing her again made him uneasy. He had never expected to feel such a sense of shame, and the idea of being vulnerable in front of her was almost unbearable. After all, he was Harrison Blackwood, the man who didn't apologize, the man who didn't admit mistakes. But what if she was right? What if the real battle was against the man he had become? One afternoon, Harrison sat alone in his penthouse, staring out over the city's skyline. He could hear the faint hum of traffic below, but it felt distant, as if it were happening in another world entirely. He had everything a man could want: wealth, success, luxury, but it didn't feel like enough anymore. He felt empty. That's when he decided he needed to find Evelyn. He needed to hear from her again, to understand why her words had affected him so deeply. But when he arrived at the courthouse, he was met with an unexpected sight. Evelyn was standing outside, talking to a colleague. She looked calm, collected, like the woman who had taken him down without ever raising her voice. Harrison hesitated for a moment before walking toward her. "Judge Evelyn," he called out, his voice slightly shaky. She turned to face him, a faint smile forming on her lips. "Mr. Blackwood," she replied. There was no hint of animosity in her tone. No judgment. Just a quiet calmness that made Harrison uneasy. He stopped himself. What was he doing? He had never been the type to apologize, to show weakness. But in that moment he knew he had to. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice low, "for what you said in court." Evelyn raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "It's just, you've made me realize something I've been avoiding for a long time," he continued, his words coming more easily now. "I've spent my entire life trying to control everything, to be the man everyone expected me to be. But I've never truly looked at myself, at who I've become. And I owe you for helping me see that." There was a long silence between them. Harrison waited for her response, but instead of the praise he expected, Evelyn's gaze softened, and she nodded slowly. "You're welcome, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice gentle. "But don't forget, it's not about what I said. It's about what you choose to do with it now." Harrison felt a pang of realization. She wasn't going to make it easy for him. She wasn't offering him a free pass, a way out of the mess he had created. If anything, Evelyn was giving him a choice: change or remain the same. And that was the most terrifying part of it all. As they stood there, a sudden wind picked up, ruffling the papers in her hands. Harrison looked at her, wondering if he would ever be able to find redemption, not just in her eyes, but in his own. He had expected to walk away from this encounter with some kind of closure, but instead, he was left with more questions than answers. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Harrison wasn't afraid of it. Whatever came next, he would face it, not as the man he used to be, but as the man he was beginning to understand he could become. But there was one last twist in this story. As Harrison turned to leave, Evelyn called out to him one last time. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice holding a note of finality. "I hope you know that change isn't something that happens overnight. It's a long journey, and it begins with one step." Harrison paused, taking in her words. For the first time, he realized that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a process. A journey that he would have to take on his own. And with that, Harrison walked away, not sure of what the future would hold, but for the first time in his life, ready to find out.